Okay, I'm just going to warn you that I'm really ornery today. So last year we had to deal with the epidemiologists kind of hogging all the attention. And so the reason economists don't like epidemiologists is because our thing is kind of making predictions that are always wrong and then moving on and pretending they weren't wrong and no one ever calling you out on it. And so the epidemiologists were kind of on our turf because I feel like you can't have too many professions doing that or people will get tired of it. And now we have the meteorologists with the heat dome. So it's getting very crowded. But this shows my commitment to you. Germany and England are playing right now, and I'm still here to talk to you. So, yeah. So, what I'm going to try to do is basically tell you everything that happened in the economy in the last year, which is not a whole lot. It was a pretty nondescript year. Not too many plot lines going on. So specifically, we're going to briefly just kind of talk about what happened with Idaho and where our economy is after COVID. Then we're going to be talking about the labor market and labor market tightness. And then I'm going to talk briefly about housing at the end. So which one of these should I talk into? I'm getting discombobulated. Does it matter?
You know what? Whichever one you prefer.
I'll just hold it. I'll just hold it. I don't want feedback, though.
Oh, that's a good point. I'll
Yeah.
grab that second one.
Okay.
That's my bad.
No, you're fine.
I was wondering what
I
you
think
were watching.
I just feel like I look dumb with like one right here and then I'm holding one and then I have one right here. So anyway, let's just jump right into it. So first off, we're going to talk about the state of Idaho's economy, and kind of the short version, not to bury the lead here, is that if you just looked at the numbers right now, you would never know that anything had gone wrong last year because Idaho has bounced back so quickly. So this is what total employment looks like in Idaho. By the way, there's going to be a lot of graphs in here, but you don't really need to care about the numbers. All you need to do is be able to tell which way the line is pointing. So we'll keep it pretty elementary because I like shapes and colors better than esoteric numbers anyway. So this is non-farm employment in Idaho. So this is kind of like our top line, total employees in Idaho. And you can see that something weird happened in 2020. You don't normally get a perfectly vertical line. That's rather unusual. Normally a recession looks more like a curve where it slopes downward rather than just plummeting over the cliff. So the easiest way to explain this is that in Idaho, March 2020, we were at the all-time lowest unemployment rate, and then in April 2020, we were at the all-time high. So we literally flipped from an all-time low to an all-time high in 1 month. And another way to put this is that about 1 out of 10 people were laid off in a single month. So this was rather severe, much steeper, much faster than anything we're used to. And of course, the reason for that is that COVID was not really an economic event. Right? So this was not anything organic happening in the economy. This was kind of imposed on the labor market by outside factors. And then something miraculous happened over the summer months, which is that the animal spirits of the people of Idaho were so strong that this state was able to chug back and get all the jobs back by the end of the year, and we actually returned to a growth path. So as of May of this year, Idaho was the only state in the country that was up over its pre-COVID job numbers. There were a few other states. I'll pretend you're applauding for me. I did that. Yes, I did a wonderful job. So there are a few other states that are kind of like at the break-even point. Utah, for example, has pretty much all of its jobs back, but there's no growth over the top of where they were before COVID. But you can see with Idaho that we returned to our growth path. So if you just drew a straight line, kind of drew the trend, you would see that we've caught up with the trend again. And we're the only state in the country to be in this situation. There are a few states where unemployment is still very, very high. Nevada and Hawaii in particular, their unemployment rates are still up around 15% because they're so dependent on tourism for their economy. And I don't know if I can think of a worse place to be during a respiratory pandemic than in the inside of a casino where the air is thick with smoke and like you can't find the sun because it's built like a maze, so you're vitamin D deficient because you're not getting any sunlight, and you're just like hitting the button like a, you know, like a rat trying to get the pellet out of the thing in the lab. So Nevada's doing very badly because that's not what people want to be doing right now. And then you're immunosuppressed because of all the alcohol. So it's just like, it's a bad recipe. But in Idaho, where we're not dependent on casinos, our economy is doing very, very nicely. So this is the number of people on unemployment in Idaho. This is kind of the flip side of that. And this is another just weird looking graph because you don't normally get vertical lines in things like this. So you can see that before COVID, we had like 10,000 people in Idaho claiming unemployment benefits. Most of those people were short-term claimants, meaning they'd just been laid off, and they were claiming benefits for less than 6 weeks. So what that means is that our economy was doing a really good job. I hate the term recycling when it comes to people, but it sounds kind of like Soylent Green-ish, but we were doing a good job recycling our unemployed, getting them back to work very, very quickly. So we had low unemployment, and it was short duration unemployment. And then we spike up to about 135,000 people on unemployment after a couple of weeks. So this is just a huge, huge explosion in the unemployed population. So keep in mind, 135,000 people on unemployment, this is not a large state. Our population is less than 2 million. So that's a huge, huge number of people drawing benefits. And then it just sort of craters over the summer as everyone goes back to work. Again, this is not what you saw in other states. In other states, as I'm going to show you on the next graph, the level of unemployment was very persistent. It remained high throughout the summer. And actually, as of the most recent week, our total unemployment claimants are back where they were before COVID. So again, this is just really, really weird. You don't see this in any other state. Utah is doing the best besides Idaho, but they're still lagging behind us quite a bit. So figuring out why this is the case was actually kind of tricky. So you might initially assume that this has something to do with how strict a state's lockdown orders were or were not, but we actually don't think that has much to do with it because there were several states that did not have any enforced stay-at-home orders whatsoever. Several Midwestern states, Iowa, the Dakotas, and yet Idaho completely outperformed them by any metric. Those states still have significantly elevated unemployment. So it seems like it actually had a lot more to do with the willingness of people to return to normal quickly, sort of hesitancy over the fears of the virus. And in Idaho, we did not have too much of that. So pretty much as soon as they were able to, people went back to normal in this state, and we see this in the numbers. So just one last look at this. We'll compare the unemployment in Idaho to the rest of the country. So the black line here is unemployment in the US, and then the blue line is Idaho. And you can see that big drop that we get at the end of the summer. You don't get that around the rest of the country. It comes down much more slowly. So we're just way ahead. We did great by every metric, and we should be really pleased with ourselves. That's kind of the story here. And thankfully, it did not seem to come with any severe public health trade-offs because our infection rate and death rate were pretty modest. So it seems like Idaho was just really well conditioned to weather the pandemic. It also helps that we're more of a suburban and rural state. We're not really reliant on really dense urban areas to drive our economy because that's where stay-at-home orders were more strict. You know, when people are living in a more dense environment, viruses spread more easily. So kind of our profile just really set us up for success here. So now we will move on to the second topic, which is labor market tightness. And this is where you're all going to get mad at me. So basically, our premise, kind of our thesis statement here, is that the US labor market has not really been tight in 2 or 3 decades, but it is now. For the first time in a long time, and people have kind of forgotten what it's like to be in a really tight labor market, and so it's going to take some mental adjustment. And furthermore, the fact that tightness returned under the cover of the pandemic has caused people to kind of write it off as a temporary effect of the pandemic that will dissipate as we return to normal, but we don't think that's the case. So Here's probably the worst slide in the deck. It's really horrible looking, I admit, because you don't care what these are. I mean, what the heck is the prime age activity rate? I don't know. Basically, these are 4 different things that I would look at if I was trying to gauge how tight the labor market is. They're related, they're all related to labor supply and how tight the supply is. And so the important thing to note is that all 4 of these things are going down over time. So these, several of these graphs are going back to the 90s or the 70s. And so what we're trying to show here is that if I was asked to gauge how tight the labor market is, I would look at any of these indicators, and they're all going the same direction over time, which is down. So the implication, essentially, is that the US labor market has been very slack. It has not truly been tight probably since the 90s. So what do I mean by a tight labor market? A tight labor market essentially means that you have across-the-board labor shortages at the same time that the economy is running really hot. So it means that demand is high. There's plenty of business to be done, and labor shortages are across the board kind of the constraining force on the economy that's holding the economy back. We have not been in a situation like that for a long time. So in a tight labor market, if you don't offer sizable raises on a regular basis, part of your workforce will spontaneously quit. That's just what happens. In a tight labor market, if you do not have a very streamlined hiring process that can get people on board very quickly and with minimal effort, they will take another job before you have finished the interviewing process. In a tight labor market, you make offers to employees and they take that to their existing employer to get a raise. Right? That's what a tight labor market is, and that used to be the norm. That's what the economy was like several decades ago, and that's been gone for so long that we've kind of forgotten that that's a viable way for the economy to run. But that's what we're returning to. So what I'm going to talk about is how we got back to this situation, why the labor market is tight again, and why we think it's going to stay tight. It's not just the result of the pandemic. So here are some reasons why tightness is starting to return. The first reason is that the economy right now is essentially superheated. So I don't know if any of you are fans of the Fast and Furious movies. I doubt you are, because I don't know that that series has fans. Even though there's like 10 of them now. Yeah, whatever. So, but in the Fast and Furious movies, which I'm pretty sure were like written by a 5-year-old, there's always some point where they have to like pour something explosive into the gas tank to make the car go faster, because that's how cars work, right? You put like nitroglycerin in it and it just goes faster. So essentially, the Federal Reserve and the federal government operated on the Fast and Furious economic model last year, which was when the economy started to blip, they just pour gasoline on it, which took the form of stimulus checks and expanded UI benefits, and my personal favorite, I love this, you saw all these headlines that were like, Fed to cut interest rates to combat virus. It's like, ooh, that's how you fight a respiratory virus, lower interest rates. So basically, between the Federal Reserve, the central bank, and Congress with all the rescue bills, the federal government poured, something like $8 trillion into the economy last year. So as a result, even though everything was idled because of the pandemic, there's more cash circulating right now than there ever has been before. So they just kind of dumped money into the economy to get it going. And the result is that right now it's superheated, probably overheated, which is why you're getting prices going up. And the implication is that the economy is running red hot. There's lots of demand. There's lots of money being spent and just not enough workers. So the demand side of the equation has overinflated due to all that money being dumped into the economy. Secondly, you had a wave of retirements last year. You had a lot of baby boomers who were working past retirement age. One thing we'd noted is that more and more workers were working past 65. And a lot of them just decided that when COVID hit, it was time to go. They didn't want to stick around and see what was going to happen. So last year, we think something like 4 to 5 million people retired, which is about twice as many as you get in a regular year. And then with home prices where they are, with the stock market being in such a strong state, conditions are really ripe for people to retire. So this is further constraining labor supply. You get a wave of retirements at the same time that the economy has the gas pedal all the way down on the floor. Third, you have constraints of insufficient childcare. We know that this is a structural problem in the U.S. economy. Childcare is in limited supply and it's very expensive. So this continues to be something keeping people out of the workforce. And we know that this is an issue because labor force participation for women dropped significantly last year compared to men. And that's just statistically, women are much more likely to stay home with children. And when we survey to try to figure out why that is, childcare consistently pops up as one of the main obstacles to people going back to work. And then fourth, with COVID, we kind of have had shifting expectations. And this has occurred at both ends of the wage spectrum. So higher wage workers kind of got used to hybrid work arrangements or even permanent work from home, and they're not shy about pursuing that as a permanent option. So we've seen a wave of people quitting so that they can try to find better telework arrangements. Secondly, you have a lot of low-wage workers that just really don't want to go back to work because I don't really know how to put it, but they've decided that working for $9 an hour just isn't cutting it anymore. And the thing about COVID is that you asked a lot of people to make sacrifices in terms of losing their job, being confined to their homes, and understandably, when that ends, people are seeking a better deal. They want to come out of sort of a sacrificial period with a better arrangement than they went in. And so what we're seeing is that employees are becoming much more assertive about what they want, and they're becoming much less shy about attacking that. So I'll show you what that looks like. First off, when we talk about superheating the labor market, this is essentially what we mean. So over on the far side, we have disposable personal income. Now you'll notice these big spikes. Those actually happen when unemployment is super high. So that's odd. Normally, this might shock you, unemployment and income do not have a positive correlation. But in this case, they did because the federal government just dumped cash into the economy. So it's ironic that the all-time high for personal income comes at the same time unemployment is at an all-time high. That's kind of odd. So you've got more money than ever floating around. But then at the same time, the labor force shrinks. So look at that big drop-off. You have something like 8 million people drop out of the labor force. And then even once it comes back, it doesn't get back to the level it was at before. That is the retirements and the people staying out because they can't find childcare. So we've got more money than ever floating around, chasing goods, as the expression goes, and fewer people than ever to staff positions. So that's essentially why we have such a tight labor market. Because the economy has this sort of supply and demand dynamic. I don't know if you've heard this expression, supply and demand. Most people, that's the only thing they remember from their undergraduate econ class. So let's think about the economy in this perspective. Household income is up. We've got stimulus checks, UI expansion, home prices are up. So people actually have a lot of money right now, kind of counterintuitively. Corporate investment is up because you've got low interest rates. Corporations have a lot of cash reserves to spend. You've got government spending up. I mean, even after all the money they spent in the last year, they just approved, something like a $2 trillion infrastructure bill. So there's more money than ever floating around. But then on the supply side, everything's tight. There's not enough raw materials and inputs. We all know that lumber shortages were a big deal. If you could afford to buy your dad a 2x4 for Father's Day, congratulations. I'm sure he's very happy. My friend and I were joking that we need to put up security cameras because people are going to come steal our planter boxes for the wood, because you can't just leave like $100,000 of wood lying on the ground. Steel is in short supply. There's not enough semiconductors, and that might not seem like a big deal, but today, I mean, everything you buy has a computer in it. Like your toaster has a computer in it, your refrigerator, your washing machine, your car has like 1 billion computers in it. So there's not enough raw materials, you don't have enough workers, and companies exhausted their inventories last year during COVID, trying to backstop the economy. And then, of course, the foreign markets are all disrupted because you still have COVID outbreaks in foreign countries that we rely on for materials and other imports. So basically, we have this like seesaw effect where demand is sky high because there's all this money floating around, and then everything on the production side is tight. So that's why you have prices rising, and that's why you have such intense competition for labor right now. So let me show you what that looks like if we talk about tight competition in labor. This is the number of workers quitting in a given month. So generally, quits are a sign of a strong economy because people generally do not quit their jobs when unemployment is really high and they don't think they can find a new job. That's kind of straightforward. So you can see that the number of quits, again, voluntary quits, tapers off in 2020 because the economy is bad, to use the technical term, and then it spikes. And then in these last few months, the number of quits has been rising exponentially every month. So this is a sign that workers understand that the labor market is very, very strong and that they have a lot of options and that they have leverage. So they are quitting their jobs. And I want to note, when we call something a quit, that does not include a retirement. A quit is when you voluntarily leave your job with the intention to stay in the labor force and find a new job. So this is explicitly job-seeking behavior. So workers understand that they have the leverage and they are not being shy at all about pursuing what they want. So for lower wage workers, this primarily indicates seeking higher wages. For higher wage workers, professionals, this generally indicates that people are seeking more flexible work arrangements. So you have this behavior on both ends of the spectrum, but people are targeting different things. So if you're a high-income professional, you're seeking a hybrid work arrangement. If you're a lower-wage service worker, you're pursuing higher wages. But this is a phenomenon that we see across the board, rising quits. And so this was the all-time high since we started tabulating quit numbers, was last month. And it just looks like it's increasing month over month. So what this results in is accelerating wage growth. So this is the annual growth of wages. The black line there is all private employees. And then I put in retail and then leisure and hospitality because I want to demonstrate that this is not just high earners that are driving wage growth. You're seeing really strong wage growth even for the service sector. So for most of the past business cycle, wage growth on average was like 2 to 2.5% per year. That's the strongest indicator that the labor market wasn't actually tight. Because if the labor market is tight, wages rise very quickly because people are competing for workers. But then suddenly, right when the economy goes south due to COVID, that's when wage growth starts to spike. So you actually see this big bump to like 5 or 6% annual raises across the board. And one thing that's very interesting is that industries recovered at different paces. That makes sense, right? We understand that hotels and restaurants recovered from COVID slower than real estate, for example, which never even went down. But what's interesting is that as industries recovered, they kind of joined the wage growth party. So that's what you see with leisure and hospitality. It was much slower. Hotels and restaurants were much slower to reopen and get back to full capacity. But once they get there, they jump right on board with the wage growth because there's labor shortages across the board. So this is the main thing that distinguishes the new tight labor market from what we were seeing before COVID. We've become used to shortages of specific skill sets. We all know that construction, for example, has been a very tight labor market. There's not enough skilled tradesmen. We know that the country has a perennial shortage of programmers, for example. But what we're seeing now is that labor shortages seem to exist across the board. Now, some people have suggested that this is due to the enhanced unemployment benefits, keeping people, people don't want to go back to work because they can just draw the unemployment benefits. Well, the problem with that theory is that this phenomenon is most severe in Idaho, where we already cut off all the expanded unemployment benefits. So you would expect Idaho to be different if it was the unemployment benefits driving that, but actually this problem is more severe in Idaho. So here's what wage growth looks like in Idaho. And I cut this up by percentiles, so it's not just the median wage, but the high earners are in green, that's the 75th percentile, and then the blue is 25th percentile, so those are lower wage workers. You can actually see wage growth is higher for lower wage workers. So this indicates that labor shortages are kind of a phenomenon across the board. So here in Idaho, just to put some perspective on this, right now there are about 70,000 open jobs in the state, and we have about 22,000 unemployed people. So at a certain point, you're essentially playing musical chairs with employees. Right? It's not an equation that you can solve because by the sheer brute force of mathematics, somebody gets left out. There are going to be job postings that are left unfilled. So the way that you make sure you fill yours is by raising wages, and that's what we're seeing across the state right now. We're waiting on some Q2 numbers for this year, but we think it's going to show really significant wage growth. Because that's just everything that we're seeing is predicting that this is going to continue to rise. So the labor market really wasn't tight. I mean, look at the wage growth in 2015 and 2016. Even as it ramps up, it doesn't get higher than 2.5%. Well, inflation is 2% per year. So when wages are rising 2.5%, you're not really talking about any kind of appreciable, real increase in people's income. But now it's starting to run. And the thing that I always point out is that we're used to language like buyer's market or seller's market when we talk about housing, but it's really important that we kind of have that mindset when we talk about labor, because that's the condition we're in. And it's a seller's market because the worker sells their labor and the employer buys it. So we kind of need to be of that mindset that that's how we're thinking about the labor market as well. Speaking of housing, I would like to briefly talk about housing, mostly because people always ask a question about it if I don't talk about it, so we're going to get ahead of it. So, anyone who thought that COVID would kind of help the housing market here cool off or slow down was quickly disabused of that notion because it's hot, right? Not just outside. Side note, I love the heat because I think that hot coffee is wrong and disgusting. And so the longer and hotter it is, I think that we can finally rid the world of hot coffee and everyone will drink iced coffee, which is how it was meant to be drunk. Anyway, so back to this. The housing market is also hot. It's not just the weather that's hot. So this is year-over-year price appreciation in Idaho, and I chopped this up by tercile. So you're probably wondering what a tercile is. Tercile means thirds, and I use the word tercile because it's fancy. So I chopped it up by thirds, and what you can see is that there's really no difference between the thirds of the market. So the top third and the bottom third really appreciated at pretty similar paces. So just like with labor, this is an across-the-board heating up of the market. And so right now we're sitting at like 25% year-over-year price appreciation in Idaho, and it just continues to rise. So here's another money word for you. This is an asymptotic graph. You can Google that. Asymptotic is when it goes whoosh, and it just goes vertical, and it makes a whooshing sound. So basically what happened was, now I apologize because we call it the donut effect, but like I was too lazy to figure out how to make a donut look good in PowerPoint, so I didn't actually use a donut to visualize it. I'll explain. So we call it the donut effect because what's happened in housing is a depopulation of the inner core of big cities. So what happened was COVID hits. You have a lot of really high income workers who are working in the congested core of big cities. And suddenly, they don't have to commute to work every day, so having a short commute is no longer super valuable to them. Suddenly, the restaurants are closed, the gyms are closed, the coffee shops are closed, and when you live in a really condensed urban environment, you're really dependent on shared spaces. you do not have a lot of private space. So you're dependent on shared spaces in terms of restaurants, gyms, the office, etc. Suddenly you no longer have access to that, and you no longer have to commute, and you have a lot of money because you work at Facebook or Amazon HQ or whatever. So what do? Well, you move to the suburb. You're not going to move away because you know that when COVID's over, your employer is probably going to say, you need to come into the office once a week or twice a week. But if it's just once or twice a week, you can bite a longer commute, so you move out to the suburb. So the urban core gets depopulated. Apartment vacancies in the core of big cities are really high right now. If you look at the apartment vacancies, they've skyrocketed because people have moved out of that kind of living arrangement, but prices in the suburbs are the epicenter of what's going on in housing. So if we just take the nearest major metro area and go over to look at Seattle, what you would find is that apartment vacancies in the densest parts of Seattle are high, but home prices in the outlying suburbs, in the Bellevues and Rentons and Edmonds of the world, home prices there are very, very high because workers are moving out to the suburbs. Well, when the high-income worker moves out to the suburbs, he allows someone already living there to cash out, and they move to Kootenai County. So there's this ripple effect going on where, and we call it the donut because there's a hole in a donut. I've never understood, why do they call it a donut hole? The ball. Because it wouldn't be a ball, it would be like a tiny little disc that got cut out of the donut. These are the things I think about. So the donut has a hole, that's the core of the urban area. Everybody moves out to the suburbs. They push people from the suburbs into smaller metro areas like Kootenai County. So the thing to remember is that because people that have lived here for a long time, they complain about the home prices and they complain about the traffic. Well, it's important to remember that for someone moving here from Seattle, both the home prices and the traffic are very modest. So home prices in Idaho could essentially double, and they would still be affordable to people from San Francisco or Seattle. So this is kind of the ripple effect that COVID set off by allowing high-income workers to move to the suburbs because they no longer have to make a daily commute. And even if they have a hybrid work arrangement where they have to come in once or twice a week, the commute from the suburb is tolerable once or twice a week. So that's essentially what's happened, and so we're getting this sort of second-order effect of COVID where it pushes everybody out to the second ring, and then the suburbs push people out to here. So we initially kind of thought that COVID might help balance out the mix of people moving here because for a long time we've had a problem where most of our new residents are retirees, and not that there is anything wrong with a retiree, but they're not economically particularly useful. So they don't do anything to alleviate our labor shortages. Or we got someone who was planning to retire soon, so they're kind of like setting themselves up for retirement, and then that's a little better, but they still have a short economic shelf life. So we were hoping that COVID would alleviate that, because if you had telework, if you had people able to work remotely, you could get more workers coming here. Well, the problem is that it seems like a lot of companies are going to a hybrid rather than a full telework arrangement. And for someone to work in Seattle and live in Kootenai County, it has to be an all or nothing proposition as far as distance work. And so the fact that it's hybrid work means that most of our new residents are still retirees. So that was something we were kind of hoping would improve with COVID, and it really hasn't. So most of the people moving here continue to be retirees, and they're able to cash out of their existing homes because COVID has pushed the workers out into the suburbs. So it's better than nothing. It's certainly better to live in a growing community than a shrinking one. We all are familiar with the complaints about growth, but let's be honest, if you've ever been to some of the smaller kind of languishing rural communities in Idaho, or I mean, if you've ever been to rural Ohio, God forbid, you understand. My sister-in-law's from rural Ohio, so I have been there, and it's not great to live in a shrinking community. So we should be glad that this area is growing despite the problems that come with growth and traffic and all of that and rising home prices. So I want to briefly talk about why homes are in short supply, because this is maybe shocking to some people, but the reason homes are so expensive is because we didn't build enough of them for a long time. Because that might shock you that if there's more of something, the price is lower. It probably doesn't, but it seems to shock some people. So this is what home construction looks like in the United States. I put this as new homes per 100,000 population because that just seemed like a nice way to express it. And again, we just need to know what direction this is pointing, and the technical term is down. So in the 70s and 80s, home construction was very high. And you'll notice that this is cyclical. We kind of expect that. When the economy's weak, home construction lags off. So you get this cyclical effect, but it's like every peak is lower than the last one. So it's just kind of trailing off. And even when home construction, like we feel like there's a lot of construction going on right now. It feels like they're building everywhere. New subdivisions popping up all over the place. But right now, home construction is still, like a third of what it was in the 70s and 80s. So we really set ourselves up for this by not building enough homes. And this was a particular problem because the housing crash kind of came at the worst possible moment for two reasons. One, the housing crash came right as a lot of millennials were choosing careers. It's really hard to convince someone to go into construction in the middle of a housing crash. So we set ourselves up for kind of a perennial shortage of construction labor with the timing of that. So if we could have moved it up 5 years, that would have been good, but unfortunately these things we don't get to hit the button and set it off when we want. But it came at a bad time. So millennials didn't go into construction. So the age of the construction workforce has risen significantly in the last 10 years, and we're just perennially short of skilled workers in construction. The other thing more generally is that the housing crash came right as we should have been building a lot of houses to get ready for the millennials to be home buyers. But again, it's hard to convince people to build lots of houses in the middle of the crash. So we were in a long-term state of decline in terms of how many houses we were building, and then this just became an acute problem because of the timing of the financial crisis. So now millennials want to buy homes, especially in big cities now that they're moving out to the suburbs, and there just aren't enough homes to go around because we built a lot of apartments. We did not build a lot of kind of accessible first-time home buyer homes. So if you think of housing like a ladder, there's a very important rung that's the first house, and that's just missing. We just weren't building enough in that rung. So that's why the housing market is so dysfunctional. Last time I looked, if you want to look at homes under $1 million on less than 5 acres in Kootenai County, so I feel like that's a pretty modest ask. There was something like 40 listed in the whole county. So it's just insane, and we haven't built enough housing, and we're trying to catch up now, but it's hard because there aren't enough workers. So let's just kind of recap all this cool stuff. So number one, the economy is running red hot because of massive stimulus from the federal government. So the Federal Reserve printed $4 trillion, dumped that in the banking sector. You had another $4 trillion worth of rescue checks and unemployment benefits. And now we've got a $2 trillion stimulus bill for infrastructure. So there's just tons of money sloshing around. That's also, incidentally, that's also why you're getting such crazy valuations with stocks, because stimulus checks kind of gamified stocks because now you had a lot of, they were supposed to be watching March Madness at work. Young men who don't want to work, they want to play games on their phone. And so sports were down because of COVID, so they're bored. And then they get a few $1,000s to play with, so they buy GameStop. So that's what happened with stocks, is stocks got kind of gamified by all the cash slushing around. That's why Nikola Motors, I don't know if you've heard this story, Nikola Motors was worth something like $200 billion in stock valuation, and all they had was a drawing of an electric truck. They'd never even built it. And so people were looking at the stock market, what is going on with these valuations? Well, there's a lot of cash sloshing around trying to find something to do with it, and you can't go out because everything's closed. So, hey, why not spent $200 on a share of GameStop. So the economy's running red hot, just so much money sloshing around, but there's not enough workers. So we're just basically in a situation where openings vastly outnumber workers. I mean, here in Idaho, it's like a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 openings per worker. And that's not going to be ameliorated anytime soon because there's just these hard demographic limits that we're up against with all the retirements that took place. So we need to get used to tight labor markets being the norm. Maybe Gen Z will kind of help alleviate this, but I don't know about you, but Gen Z is weird. So I wouldn't count on them to fix this. We're just going to have a tight labor market, especially for skilled positions. And then we have just upward price pressure on everything. Wages, housing, lumber, there's a lot of money and not enough stuff. Whether that stuff is workers or raw materials or stocks, there's not enough stuff for all the money floating around, so that's why wages continue to rise. And that's the essential reason for the higher inflation we're seeing. It really doesn't have anything to do with like the US dollar being diseased or anything. It's just there's a lot of money chasing not enough stuff to buy, and so prices go up when that happens. So I had this obligatory question slide, but I've been informed that we are doing a question panel at the end, so I'm not going to take your questions. Makes me feel powerful to deny it.
Thanks so much, Sam. Give it up for Sam, everybody.